everybody's been referring to John and Andy and Peter, and I think nobody really knows Peter. Peter, if you could just wave, because I'm sure the attendees don't know you. Peter was my thesis student at the University of Buffalo, and the magic wire cutter was his thesis project, and so we are sponsored by John and Boston Valley, and so we're very proud of him and the stuff he's doing, spearheading at Boston Valley. So John, Andy, and Peter, what I wanted to maybe ask you guys to get a little bit started in this conversation is, just reflecting on some of the projects, some of the challenges, just from the manufacturing side, things that are kind of pushing your techniques and technologies, and you can, we'll give you a good 10, 15 minutes as I go, and then maybe we can move it into conversation.
Sure. Go extrusion first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So the extrusion process is one that you can see through the evidence of what was presented today is very difficult to execute correctly. So for us at Boston Valley and for Andy Brain in the Matter Factory, there is a lot that you have to get right in order for a die to run the way that we expect to see it on a facade application. So when a project is executed, a lot of that happens behind the scenes, but the interesting part with ACAW is no one comes to us in ACAW asking for flat panels. We're always doing these really interesting dynamic shapes that our operators look at and go, we have to do what? And so that starts kind of an iterative process where we can look at how we design dies and improve them to start to accommodate these dynamic shapes. And that's, I think, one of the things that's interesting about ACAW is a lot of the shapes that we make for this presentation, we probably wouldn't do otherwise. Some with good reason, and some of them do turn into very interesting experiments.
Andy, did you want to reflect a little bit on some of it, because you've had to build some of these shapes?
Yeah, so I mean, the amount of learning that I have to do for each project is pretty immense, and I love that, but it's difficult. I mean, it's really challenging. All of the projects have their area that is innovative and pushes what I know in my studio. I mean, the cool thing is that John and Peter and I and everybody there at Boston Valley, they, I think, understand that my shop is not the factory, right? And so what I'm able to do here is, at best, sometimes just sort of imitate what would be done at the plant so that there's a nice sort of connection, the processes that I'm doing there. And I mean, I can't count how many times I've just sat in the studio, sometimes late at night, thinking, how do they do this at the factory? And that's a thing that I really have. The more I work through ACAW and with Boston Valley, the more impressed I am with the main plant's sort of facility with the material.
Any particular projects, maybe, if you want you guys pick some of those and maybe reflect back to the teams? I mean, you may have already had these conversations, but the attendees haven't really heard these, and sometimes it's useful to say, bring up some of those challenges that you had and conversations that were actually really revealing.
Well, I think, just speaking on behalf of Pelley Clark Pelley and SOM, they got to come back for a second time because the research isn't done. So we're really trying to solve the problem and deliver some innovation without a disappointment. So that first go around, you typically have some failure, and you got to be used to that. So you can't come into this exercise thinking it's going to be 100% successful. And I think that's how we all learn from each other. And it's certainly helpful to have a ceramic artist like Andy that we learn from him, believe it or not, a lot of little tricks and a lot of really interesting proprietary stuff that you get some synergy going just with an artist studio in a factory environment. And then when we apply that to the research projects, we're kind of gaining knowledge ourselves, and we're moving the whole architectural design community forward in a direction where they want to see the product moving. So I think it's really a great exercise, and don't be surprised if it's at least 2 trips to the ACAW event before you really get what you want out of it. So.
Yeah, in terms of the teams, so there were 7 teams that I worked on here at the plant, and I mean at my facility, and each one, like I said before, sort of had its challenges. I'll just sort of go through the list in terms of today's presentations, like sort of starting with Handel. The thing that I think was really strong about their project is they really figured out, at least at this stage, sort of how the connections and the hardware, how that really would be integrated, and is it realistic to scale it up, and what would it take? Because sometimes, you know, that can be sort of pushed down the road and not focused on. And so I think their emphasis on that early on was really good, you know, and it made us a real strong project where I can really imagine that one scaling and not having to go through a whole new redesign because of sort of hardware and connection issues. I'm sure there would be changes, as they mentioned in their presentation. They would suspect that as well. But also the glaze for their project. We came across a lot of really interesting glazes with Handel, I thought, in looking at iridescence, and where they sort of settled is pretty beautiful. I mean, I've seen the most of it. I mean, everybody else has just gotten a little sample of it, but it's the closest thing I can just. It's like if the Aztecs sort of made a glaze for some jungle temple. It's like this gold green. It's really striking. It's not clearly what you would want to put on every building, but it's really beautiful. And that's something that just sort of came out of, you know, that windy road of glaze research. For Perkins and Will, you know, their piece was actually large, you know, like to slip cast this thing. I mean, the mold, when assembled and filled with clay, is probably 400 pounds, probably. And it has to flip in order to get the piece out, right? So the mold is fragile, it's heavy, the piece is wet, and so there's this sort of dance that has to happen with sort of demolding that and making that. And this would be one of those times where I'm thinking at the plant, like, how would they do this? How would Chuck over in slip casting pull this off? And you know, they have a forklift with an attachment to flip molds, and they have some things that I don't have. But a lot of it is just sort of like knowledge too. So it's maybe a call to John, like, hey, I'm struggling with this. What do you think I should do? And that's sort of how we make it around that sort of issue. If we go to PLP, you know, that was an interesting design in the sense that there's a lot of complexity and nuance. And from afar, it's a simple tile. It's a small tile. It's sort of 8 inches by 8 inches. And there's a kind of girth to the tile that I do not associate with tiles of that sort of format. Like, it's a really heavy, solid piece of ceramic. And to me, I would now like to sort of talk with John and the team and see, like, okay, is this the right, like, when you see it physically, we all know that it sometimes goes through a big shift when it comes off the computer screen and it becomes physical. And to me, that project did that quite a bit, where it looked like a small uniform tile, and then when you get it off, it's like a 6-pound tile that's pretty substantial. And maybe that's appropriate for the time scale that the facade would last, and that's a question I would have. The KPF project is really amazing, I thought, and their sort of willingness to embrace and kind of push the recycled glass early on, even though, I in Boston Valley is really upfront about sort of the unknowns involved, even though other, recycled glass is not some brand new thing to use as glaze. It's used in the sort of tile industry, and, places like Kohler may use it some. But for the type of object, the sort of level of attention given to it and the sophistication in the glaze for sort of an architectural facade, it's a new thing, to use that much of it and not just have it be a small filler and not play a part in the aesthetics. So that's new. And that was really cool to have their sort of support and willingness to kind of push that. LMN, that project was also, I thought it was nice to have. It really complemented the rest of the projects. It was very different in the sense that it was the only sort of vessel. I mean, Perkins and Will is sort of a vessel-like form, and the sort of stacking and double-sided nature of it I thought was really interesting, developing that cartilage that would be between the ceramic pieces and them actively doing that research on their end I thought was really strong. And it'd be nice to, all of these I'm really looking forward to sort of completing the batches. And then we go to Studio Gang. I mean, they were incredibly, I think, gracious with the results that I provided them. We saw one of the pictures of my extrusion, and sort of how that sort of failure. And it's going to be nice to sort of hand off that die to the pros at the main factory and have them pull that off. And then, SOM, it was nice to watch from sort of afar to see how that developed. And I know Nat at Boston Valley, he was the one to really put that slip and glaze combination on the work right off of Peter's machine, and you can see that it was in good hands. And I think that area of like coming up with surfaces and coatings that work in tandem with Peter's machine is a really interesting area, and it's an area that I think more work could be done. We already talked some about the Pelly-Clark Pelly. For me, it was just really cool to see a glaze that I developed on a scale and on an object that's designed so well and thought through so well, and all the effort. I texted John saying, I think that project would look beautiful with just like the standard Boston Valley glaze on it, and which it would. I love seeing it with that crystalline glaze. But in say the studio arts, you don't want to be making things that you need the glaze to be beautiful for it to be a compelling object. Like when it really works, it's this unison of the form and the surface together. And I think the form that it's going on, you could put almost any glaze on that design and it would look beautiful in light and shadow. But it's magical to see that much of that glaze on a facade. So, and I don't know if let's see, Smith Gill, I think that project was also, it was difficult in terms of casting these large pieces, even though they were sort of scaled down. And I've built up a lot of stock here of their material that's unglazed, of their prototypes. And so I think they, will like to see the sort of second go around on their forms. And one of the conversations John and I have had over the last weeks or two is just sort of how much effort it takes to make the one first piece or the second piece. It's, 80 or 90% of the effort is just to make the one. And so, the work came down to the line here, down to the finish line. And now it sort of feels like, okay, now I'm really ready to start making this stuff. And I think that that's probably experienced on a bigger scale at the plant when they finish sort of smaller buildings, like that they're like really ready to ramp up.
Are there any specific questions that the teams have just now reflecting back on their work and their process for John or Peter or Andy?
I've got a question that is maybe geared towards John and Peter. So looking at the projects that have been talked about that Boston Valley has kind of produced some stuff for, they've mostly been in the US, but with PLP being in the UK, it makes me wonder, hypothetically, let's say that a project was being worked on in, assuming Australia is the farthest place from Buffalo, that it would go to. What would the roadmap to working with Boston Valley on something like that be? Would it be as a consultants, where then you're working with local terracotta manufacturers, since it seems like just about every country has a history with terracotta? Or is it cheaper to, say, produce them in Buffalo and then ship them using traditional methods of shipping? Where does the economic trade-off and the intellectual property trade-off, kind of where is that line?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that you used Australia as an example, because we are currently boxing material that's headed for the port, that's going to get on a boat and make its way to Australia in the coming weeks. So we do jobs kind of everywhere. Obviously, we tend to focus more on the US, but the shipping being what it is, we are able to design and supply products everywhere. And as a manufacturer, we're not actually on buildings, installing the material. That's usually a local contractor that's handling that. So our role is simply to design the material and make the material and ship the material. And
Well, yeah, I mean, we look at it like, architecture is sculpture. You guys are some of the top firms, and, we're all trying to really express ourselves with this material. And sometimes it's hard to find other manufacturers that can duplicate what the other guys are doing. We get all that. We're very competitive here, and if it's just a matter of shipping it overseas, for us, that's a small logistical issue, but we don't mind working anywhere. Certainly we like working locally, but I think it's a small planet and everybody's getting to know everybody. So, we just know that this material is just a fantastic building material, and we're just trying to reinvent it. So if it means going to Australia or New Zealand or Japan, we're all on board. Half the fun is going to visit these places and meeting people in different parts of the world. Unfortunately, we're under COVID restrictions, and hopefully next year we can open it back up and get back to where we're networking face to face. But I think just the way we're doing this exercise here through the webinar is fantastic. So it's kind of neat to see how people can tune in all over the world and kind of see what's going on.
Very cool. Thank you. It's good to see that you guys, like, I tried to come up with a super difficult problem, and you're already like did it, been there, done that.
Right. Great question, though.
I've got a question about. I think this is aimed toward. I think this is for John and Peter. Can you guys hear me all right? By the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as you saw, there's some aspirations that aren't exactly, say, like, I don't know, off-the-shelf techniques, right? That's part of like most of what we're all interested in, is finding places where we can push the envelope, but also find, or in say in the case of the research that we were doing, rediscovering maybe some lost techniques or applications, I should say. I'm just curious from an industrial perspective, right? You have a business and you produce terracotta pieces and you ship them around the world. Which of these avenues maybe seem a little bit too aspirational, and which do you think seem a bit more concrete? I won't ask you to call out any specific projects, but I remember we had some very good conversations early on. I remember Peter meeting with you and Andy and Mitchell and talking about, like, what is the what is the industry looking at? Let's put architects aside for a second, but what is the industry looking at, and where is the industry trying to maybe strengthen its foothold or maybe expand into different footholds? So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, I think industry is always looking for, faster, cheaper. That's not what Boston Valley's about. We're really a niche factory. We're not trying to grow to some gigantic monster. We're not trying to push it to a commodity. We're the opposite. We're controlling our size. We're trying to work with a bunch of skilled architects who consider themselves on the craft end of things and align ourselves with that mindset. Life's too short. You'll kill yourself trying to drive it into the ground. It's more about trying to understand the material and see, what it possesses that can really make some beautiful architecture. So, it's really a mindset, I guess, and a philosophy for us as a manufacturer.
John, there's a really interesting question that I think you could really answer that's coming through the chat. This is about the weight of the projects. I think, Andy, you're sort of also maybe answering. It says, many projects have the issue of heaviness in production and so on. Is there any exploration on other material mixes to make the blocks lighter, the material lighter?
Yeah, we're working with Dr. Carney, obviously, because he's part of our research wing from Alfred, where I still have some strong roots involved with the university and the CACT. And we're constantly, quietly, behind the scenes, exploring the microchemistry and the microstructure of what we can do to keep the weight down and thin it down and get some different properties out of the material. And we know they exist. So we're doing, the laboratory research behind the scenes to solve those problems to really, and still deliver a superior product. So when you do that, you have to put years of research in before you can release it to the market. And, we're heading in that direction, and we know it. So a lot of good things are going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, and apart from the issue of the actual density of the material, we found with a lot of the design projects that by changing the design or changing the module size or changing how it ties back to the building, you can dramatically affect how much weight is being tied back with each piece. If it's, reconfiguring the cells so that they are thinner and more dense, or making other changes to the form so that you still have the expression you're looking for on the exterior. So take the Smithfield piece, for example. In order to create a very large fin, we actually made 2 flat, thin tiles that greatly reduce the weight. So decisions like that can affect how much physical terracotta is hanging off the building without actually changing the density of the product, which is good for us, obviously, because we've done a lot of testing and research to get to where we are on our clay bodies, and it would involve that same level of testing and research to get a new lighter product to pass the same stringent freeze-thaw, pull-out test, all that sort of requirement-based testing to make sure that we can spec it on a building.
I think that's so, like, knowing the full weight of Perkins and Will's panel, or at least the assemblage of the panel. That's one of the avenues that I think we're really interested in, kind of really pushing more of our research and development into, and really introducing the combination of not only just a sort of design ethos and aesthetic, but also digital practice and digital fabrication, and rolling that into potentially figuring out areas in which we can reduce the actual usage of our terracotta, much like ETH Zurich and their Smart Slab, but also, like integrating simulation in regards to how the terracotta will actually shrink. I think that was originally one of our biggest things, is like, what happens once this terracotta piece is fired? Can we do a comparative analysis between the digital model and the physical model? Like, where can we see any sort of shrinkage? Just for us as as an office to really be able to understand what happens in the in-between phase of producing a digital model and getting a physical result, because I think that's super important, right? Because we can You know, I exist in digital world all the time, like at 20, like almost 24/7 of my design life, and you know, seeing something physical is always something humbling, and it's something that, you know, it feeds back into our practice.
Andy, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think another thing that, to that end, that's why we really like to do these the exploration prototypes, so that we can, you know, quickly test an idea and see what it's going to do. And even on projects, we'll do VMUs, PMUs. John talked about this a little bit in his presentation yesterday, where us as manufacturers, we know quite a lot about how the material is going to respond, but you still like that verification to see this is exactly how this glaze is going to appear on this form at this firing temperature, and nail down all the variables so that we know we have something that we can repeat. And sometimes it does take a little bit of extra R&D testing before the project starts to get that really nailed down.
Gustav, go ahead.
Oh, hey, I started by raising my hand physically. I can't believe after 5 months of Zoom, I still don't remember that we can do that digitally. So thanks, first of all, you know, ACAW organizers, Boston Valley, Omar and Andy and John and Mitch and everyone. This has been great as always. I think I kind of know the answer to this, but I sort of want to highlight the amazing setup that has been sort of fairly recently formalized with Matter Factory becoming a sort of test kitchen for Boston Valley. So, you know, as far as I understood it last year, Andy, when you described this to me, you're set up in as similar a way as possible as Boston Valley, but in a smaller scale, but just so that you'll get the minimum of glitches sort of with translating from, say, one type of kiln to another, etc. And I, you know, with so much of research and development or research in general being mainly a problem of scalability, I'm just curious to know, first of all, how that setup came about, and also how unique it is. I don't think I've ever heard of it before. That sort of relationship, you know, an experimental studio which is formally linked to a larger scale producer. So just be curious to hear a bit about that.
Well, my side of it is, I mean, I participated in the first ACAW, and I knew of Boston Valley, of course, and so before that, and I just wanted to be a part of it. I think like who Boston Valley works with and the projects that they do are just so exciting, you know, and so interesting. And for really more than 10 years, I've been sort of building this facility here in Kansas City. And it just is just this weird thing. It just was like the right time. It fit perfectly, I think, in terms of what Boston Valley needed at the moment, because I mean, what maybe doesn't need to be said is that Boston Valley needs to run their business. You know, they need to produce and come in and meet deadlines, which they're incredible at. And it's really difficult to do that and then also take on lots of weird projects that can kind of gum up the works, you know, for lack of a better way of saying it. Because there's so many unknowns in research that you can guess how long something will take, but it's really hard to accurately judge and plan for complexity when dealing with innovation. And so the fact that it's off-site, you know, I mean, it'd be great if I was right next to the plant, but in a way, there's a sort of firewall, just the physical distance that I can't get sucked into production. I can't help with production in any real way. Where I'm really helpful is if I can do some of the things that are in the early stages that just take time, and then give that information as quickly to Boston Valley as possible, and then we get this sort of feedback loop kind of going. And really, John and my thought on this, I think, was really similar right from the get-go. Like, as a systems thinker and someone dealing with ceramics, both of us know that every little detail, if it can be the same, it should be the same. You have to kind of remove these sort of variables that can kill you down the line when the way I mix my slip is different than the way they do, and so it can show up in some weird way. So we've sort of worked on that quite diligently to mirror things as much as possible.
I had a close
Yeah, and I
friend
think if you
who,
look at the two projects, so both SOM and PCP, those projects were initially developed in the Matter Factory, and we were able to take the glazes and put them on pieces and put it through the production kilns here, and those results speak for themselves. So we've definitely gotten better at the collaboration.
Well, you know, we vetted Andy out pretty hard, so we went and me and Peter checked him out about 5 years ago, I think, and snooped around a little bit. And Andy was pretty open, and just like we are. But we had a mutual connection through our university. There was a level of trust, and you know, we kicked it around. And to be honest with you, Mitch is responsible for putting us together. I think we got to give, you know, a tip of the hat to Mitch Spring, because he was out there realizing that this thing's going to grow and we're going to need some help, and definitely had to offload it. So we were just, you know, trying to find the right person we could team up with to, you know, cook in the kitchen kind of the same way. And I think it's working out pretty good. And, you know, we're all learning from it. So we're excited, and we do like the distance. It's kind of fun, you know. We're like trying to plan these trips out to Kansas City, but we get too busy. So, you know, usually twice a year, Andy will come visit the plant. We try to get out there to see him at least once a year. But we know where he is. We know how he operates, and there's a level of trust.
That's great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
I think we're now coming to more or less our conclusion. We did make up some time. It was a pretty long afternoon and very intense. One of the things I did want, I know there's still some attendees here, I did want everybody to just sort of what's going to follow up after this get together. The hope is, of course, still to do an assembly, and whether that will be hosted on that lovely roof deck at Studio Gang or somewhere else. I think that's something still to be planned. I think it would be great to sort of find a place for doing the assembly. At the same time, as you all know, we do the books, and the books are a really good way to sort of reflect on the work, but also bring some of the things that kind of get put down on the cutting floor back into the discussion. And they really are a great way for others in academia, and lots of people running studios, doing other things. People in practice are using them as a way for inspiration, but also getting some direction as to how they may proceed working with a manufacturer and understanding this material. To that end, I just wanted to sort of, for the sake of the attendees, just sort of show our website. This is where many things are laid out, and under research and analysis here, you will have some highlights of the different teams that have taken part, but also there's tremendous amount of information in terms of presentations and stuff that can also be downloaded. We have yet to really put our links to the books here, but we'll do that as well. And eventually a lot of this, hopefully this website becomes a repository for some kind of interface to be able to talk about the different things that are going on. Outside of that, you know, I look forward to working with all the teams as we move forward towards actually designing the book. We will be in touch pretty soon in terms of just an outline for you to start sort of framing. So before this disappears and you you forget about this wonderful experience. Most of the time, we sort of have that talk when we're having a dinner together, which would happen right after this wonderful meeting, and we would be probably at the Martin House in the lovely pavilion, looking at the right building, and we could talk more about this. But in lieu of that, we'll have to sort of do with the Zoom call. And I do hope that you have found it fulfilling, and we can find a way to sort of make this thing happen. So please keep your emails open, because we do want to reach out to you again and get the projects together for the publication. That's a very important final step. It also helps us keep all of the work together that is now sort of probably in your hard drives. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for participating. First of all, some recognitions. Mitchell Bring never showed himself on the screen, but has been mentioned a few times. Mitch, as always, thank you so much for herding us through this whole process. It's always a difficult task and doesn't get enough credit, which it deserves. And thank you to the teams for giving the incredible amount of time that you do give towards this. You take it super seriously, as I think any good residency one should. And your research actually is pushing this technology in ways that we can't imagine on our own. And of course, Boston Valley Terra Cotta, the main sponsor of this, and where all the magic does happen. Thank you, John. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, the whole staff. Thank you, Andy, for making this such a great ACAW. So with that, I'm just going to sign off. Thank you, everybody, and have a great evening.